in and out. So what we're going to do here to get everybody caught up, you always want to listen to either the opening statements or the closing arguments or both. Well, the closing arguments are the last thing that the jury heard. So let's listen to the best of the closing arguments, starting with the state.
On January 19th of 2021, Tara Baker was taken out of this world. Her life extinguished by the defendant in this case, Edrick Faust. Mr. Faust entered Tara's home and caught her as she was going through her morning routine. He stabbed her, brutally bashed her head, and strangled her as he forcibly raped her, sodomized her orally, and sodomized her anally. When she was discovered by firefighters and police, her hair still smelled like shampoo. Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard the evidence in this case for 2 weeks and went through about a week of jury selection before that. And we're here at the closing argument after a family has waited 25 years for justice for their daughter. And it's time for you to write the last chapter of this story. The state, in closing argument, is afforded the opportunity to go both first and last in the summation. The reason for that is that we bear the burden of proof in this case. And that burden is guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. It's a burden that I accept readily. The burden never shifts, and the defendant is not required to present any evidence ever. And it's a burden that I accept readily on behalf of the state of Georgia because it is a burden that we meet by bringing you the truth, the facts, and the evidence in the case. Not conjecture, not unsupported speculation, not statements about the evidence that end up being false after you actually hear it, but the truth and the facts of this particular case. You have a 12-count indictment that you will consider. And during this initial portion of our closing argument, we are not intending to tell you the same things that we're going to tell you at the end. I respect your time. I'm going to try my best not to repeat myself. As it relates to count one is malice murder. And the law in this case will come from Judge Lott, and you should look to her jury charge in order to determine the law that applies to this case. But I expect that Judge Lott will instruct you that in count one, malice murder, it requires that the state prove that Mr. Faust did unlawfully and with malice aforethought on January 19th of 2001 caused the death of Tara Baker, a human being, by strangling her with a cord and stabbing her. And in count 2 through count 5, I believe Judge Lott will instruct you that Mr. Faust is charged with felony murder as it relates to the felony offenses of burglary, aggravated sodomy, and rape. And I believe that what she will instruct you as it relates to those offenses will come in the charge, and we will discuss that. After those offenses of burglary, aggravated sodomy, 2 counts, rape, as well as possession of a knife during the commission of a felony, you will receive further instructions. And one of those instructions that Judge Lott is going to give you is about what we just discussed, the issue of reasonable doubt. And I think what the judge will instruct you in part is a reasonable doubt means just what it says. It is a doubt of a fair-minded, impartial juror who is honestly seeking the truth. It is a doubt based on common sense and reason. And I know sometimes it can be difficult as a juror to understand how you should weigh the evidence, but I think that the end of that second sentence is maybe the most instructive as to what a juror's role is. And a juror's role is to seek out the truth in the evidence that is presented before you. Your job is not to seek out doubt. It is to seek out truth. And the truth in this case is that Mr. Faust is guilty of each of the offenses for which he is charged in the indictment. I think it's important when we discuss malice murder to talk about what is required of the state in order to prove that. The state does not have to prove premeditation. The state does not have to prove motive. Malice aforethought in the state of Georgia does not mean premeditation. The state has to...
All right, let's slip on a commercial break. We'll get you back into that Georgia courtroom. We're going back and watching the closing arguments from Friday in the Tara Baker murder trial. Stay with us.
This is the story of the Richins. Eric, a father of 3, met an untimely end, and Corey, his widow, wrote a children's book on grief.
She's also charged now with his murder.
He was faced with betrayal and terror.
I know her innocence.
Is their story a tragic romance?
Or a twisted tale of grief?
The truth will come out.
The Grief Author Murder Trial. Live coverage begins February 23rd on Court TV.
He was arrested for criminal trespass, battery, assault, fleeing police, distributing narcotics, harassment, stalking, and a lost count of all his parole violations. This defendant cannot go to Waffle House without throwing a tantrum, nor the 40 Watt without breaking a man's jaw, nor cruise without being arrested for domestic violence. At least we forget that he is barred from UGA for indecent exposure.
This morning we are in Georgia for the Tara Baker murder trial. Deliberations now, we're being told, begin at 12:30 this afternoon. The UGA law student was found dead in her burning apartment in 2001. The fate of the man accused of killing her will be decided by these 12 that listened very closely on Friday to the closing arguments. And that's what we're doing on this Monday morning. Let's go back into the courtroom. Prosecution close.
The state has to prove that Mr. Faust caused the death of another person, Miss Baker. He did so unlawfully, meaning without any type of justification, and he did so with malice aforethought. And malice, as the term is used here, is not necessarily ill will or hatred. It is rather an unlawful intent to kill. As I stated before, the state does not have to prove premeditation in order to prove murder. If a killing is done with malice, it is murder regardless of how briefly the malicious intent existed. No specific length of time is required for malice to arise in the defendant's mind. Malice may be formed in a moment, and instantly a fatal wound may be inflicted. The malice in this case is clear. I'm not going to display in front of you now those images from both the autopsy and the crime scene that you've been subjected to. I know that they are not pleasant images to look at, but if you are looking for evidence of malice in this case, the manner in which Ms. Baker's life was taken was all the evidence of malice that's necessary to support a conviction under the laws of the state of Georgia. I think that the judge is also going to instruct you on felony murder. And although she will give you an instruction at the end, I think it's worth bringing up for you as you consider the evidence as argued to you by the attorneys in these closing arguments. And I think what the judge is going to instruct you is that for felony murder, the state must prove that the defendant caused the death of another person by committing a felony. In causation, as it relates to felony murder, I'd expect the judge will instruct you that you may find the defendant guilty of felony murder if you believe that he or she caused the death of another person by committing the felony of, and in each count, it will have the predicate felony or the underlying felony that's the basis for those felony murder counts. By committing the felony of whichever felony is the predicate, regardless of whether he intended the death to occur. There must be some causal connection between the felony and the death. Felony murder is not established simply because the death occurred at the same time as or shortly after the felony was attempted or committed. The felony must have directly caused the death or played a substantial and necessary part in causing the death, regardless of when the death ultimately occurred. And so when we're talking about burglary as a predicate act for felony murder, what we're talking about is the commission of that burglary, the entry into the home in order to commit the sexual offenses that are relayed in the burglary, being a substantial and necessary part of causing the death. The evidence in this case establishes that. It also establishes the predicate felony of aggravated sodomy being, again, a substantial and necessary part in causing the death in this case. It also establishes the evidence in the case that the rape and then the aggravated assault of strangulation and stabbing Miss Baker as predicate acts of the felony murder also played a substantial step in causing her, substantial and necessary part in causing her death. So that's what felony murder means. It means committing a felony that plays a substantial and necessary part in causing the death of Miss Baker in this case. I know that's not something that jurors typically know of necessarily as it relates to the way that the law is applied to those circumstances, so I felt like it was important to go over those things with you. The possession of a knife during commission of a felony, I think the arson in the first degree is pretty clearly self-explanatory. It's clearly from when Mr. Faust takes the blanket out of the living room, lights it on fire, and goes to start the fire in Miss Baker's bedroom. Possession of a knife during commission of a felony. Obviously, the knife used in this matter is longer than 3 inches in length. I think that's been clearly established by the evidence in the case. And then that knife was used in a felony involving another person, that being Miss Baker's murder as alleged in the indictment. So as you're listening to the evidence, those are the things that you are listening for. As it relates to the rape charge, that is carnal knowledge, meaning that Mr. Faust penetrated Miss Baker's vagina with his penis forcibly and against her will. The evidence of force and against her will is very clear from the images from the crime scene. As it relates to the offense of aggravated assault in count 5, I think that the aggravated assault being the strangulation with a cord and the stabbing. As it relates to the 2 counts of aggravated sodomy, one is for the oral sodomy forcibly and against her will that was performed by Mr. Faust on Miss Baker, and then the other one is the anal sodomy forcibly and against her will performed by Mr. Faust on Miss Baker. Ladies and gentlemen, the next thing that I want to talk to you about is what is evidence and what is not evidence. Evidence is what you hear from the witness stand and the exhibits that are emitted, the videos that were played for you, and the things that will go back with you into the jury room. What I say is not evidence, whether it was an opening statement, whether it was in questions that I asked witnesses, or anything else that I've said to you. This closing argument is not evidence. It is my argument to you about what the evidence shows. The same thing goes for the defense in this case. Nothing that Mr. Cruz says is evidence. No questions that Mr. Cruz asked are evidence. When there's a conflict between what you've heard on the witness stand and what it is that Mr. Cruz says or what I say, remember, what we say is not evidence. So when Mr. Cruz says to you that the hairs that were found in Miss Baker's hands were going to be proven to be Mr. Melton's hairs, that...
Excuse me. May I see counsel at the bench, please?
Ladies and gentlemen, you may remain.
All right, the old sidebar during the close on Friday. Let's bring in former prosecutor Tommy Pope. Tommy, the defense here was the other guy did it. It was the boyfriend. The jury got to see the boyfriend. The state is all about forensics. Who wins?
It's going to be a tough one. I think it's obviously the age of the case is one thing. The forensics have come in, but the forensics touch on both of them. The best thing I think the prosecution's got as far as the boyfriend is he's got a reason for his DNA to be there, while the defendant would not. But I think it's going to be a tough case. I've tried cases like this too, where the defense was extremely combative. The sidebar now is on the issue of the defendant attorney saying something that never showed up in evidence. And it's going to be interesting to see how the judge rules, because certainly I think the prosecutor's got a right to point that out. But sometimes the defense can try too hard. And if they push too hard, I think it can push the jury back toward the prosecution.
That's a very good point. The defendant didn't take the stand in this case. Likely a good idea. Any reason the defendant would be in her apartment or connected? I mean, to me, you pointed out, that's the difference. The boyfriend, whether you thought he was a little bit awkward on the stand or not, there's nothing that backs up the allegation except for the defense is saying, well, he seems guilty to us.
Well, and then for the jury's standpoint, I believe he had an alibi and had alibi witnesses. I didn't see those, but it's my understanding. And so he had a alibi of not being there, even though clearly his DNA was, but again, they were boyfriend and girlfriend. The locations of the DNA can be somewhat questionable for the jury. And you never know with 12 jurors what one would hang up on.
Yeah. And they don't need to say, the jury's not deciding which of the two did it. They're deciding whether there's any doubt, reasonable doubt, that this guy at the defendant's table did it. And by bringing the boyfriend in, may or may not have helped it. We'll see. It's an interesting case, that's for sure. We're going to break. Coming up, we're going to have the defense closings in the Tara Baker case. And later, they're just starting to stir there in the Georgia courtroom. The trial against Colin Gray. He's in the courtroom. He's the father accused of supplying an AR-15 to an alleged high school shooter. Stay with us.
For decades, everyone who loved Tara wanted to know who killed Tara Baker. Ladies and gentlemen, Edrick Faust killed Tara Baker. Edrick Faust sexually assaulted Tara Baker. Edrick Faust set her house on fire.
This morning we are in the Tara Baker murder trial. The question, will defendant Edrick Faust be convicted of murdering the UGA law student? Deliberations expected to begin just after noon Eastern. We're going back and watching the very best from the closing arguments. We watched the state now. Here's the defense.
The case presented to you these last 3 weeks, including jury selection, is what can only be described as a story of negligence, a carelessness for the life and the death of Ms. Baker that extends far past indifference. As you've heard through this trial, we have brought you more facts about Ms. Baker than the state. We've brought you information regarding how Ms. Baker was, that she believed in justice, that she believed in fairness, and that she believed in listening to everything before making a decision. She's similar to a jury. The state is bringing Mr. Faust before you today to accuse him of crimes that he did not commit. And of course, you don't just take my words for it, you look at the evidence. The state presented no evidence that Mr. Faust, if it's his DNA, you have to decide if it's his DNA, and we'll get into that. But the state presented no evidence that Mr. Faust's DNA means murder. The state presented no evidence that Mr. Faust's DNA means rape. The state presented no evidence that Mr. Faust's DNA means burglary. The state presented no evidence that Mr. Faust's DNA means arson or any of the other charges that they charged him with in this indictment. Mr. Faust and everyone involved in this case would like to thank you for your time, your dedication, and your willingness to put 100% of your attention into this case. And put aside your very, we understand how important it is, but your very important personal and business matters. But most of all, I want to thank you all for your courage. Because courage is what this moment demands. Not just to listen, but to stare directly at injustice and say, not here, not now, not on our watch. And that's what you're being asked to do. Stare down injustice. I want to start with a simple truth. You folks, not us, not anybody in this courtroom, you folks are the last line of defense between an innocent man and a system that has tried to break him. They falsely accused him, and they tried mightily to bury the truth. This case was corrupted from the start. It was corrupted by biases. It was corrupted by political pressure and a need to avoid admitting a mistake was made or mistakes were made in the initial investigation that you all heard about. And most fatally, it was corrupted by a lead investigator whose misconduct infected every single part of this case from the top to bottom. In our opening statement last week, we told you what questions to ask. We gave you a list of questions in our opening statement that the state would need to answer. And we warned you about the questions. We told you that the state will not be able to answer these questions with the evidence that they presented. And we begged you to try to answer those questions with the evidence that the state presented. Those questions were, how does Mr. Faust's DNA simply being present in Ms. Baker's body, and again, you have to determine what the facts are. You may say it's not his DNA, but we're going to say worst case scenario if you say it is. How does Mr. Faust's DNA simply being present in Ms. Baker's body, along with 2 other DNA profiles, establish that he is the person that killed Ms. Baker? The next question, when did Mr. Faust's DNA get in Ms. Baker's body? Where's that evidence? If Mr. Faust killed Ms. Baker, how did Mr. Faust get into Ms. Baker's home? How did Mr. Faust get away from Ms. Baker's home unseen? If he committed the crime in the morning hours, I believe they said between 8 and 8:30 from the testimony in the stand when the individuals were seen walking in the neighborhood. If Mr. Faust killed Ms. Baker, why was the hair that was found in her hand, around her body, and on her body that did not belong to her, why was it of Caucasian origin? What evidence does the state have placing Mr. Faust in Ms. Baker's home? How How does the evidence that the state has presented to you support that Mr. Faust broke into Ms. Baker's home, sodomized Ms. Baker, viciously beat Ms. Baker, raped Ms. Baker, strangled Ms. Baker, stabbed Ms. Baker in the neck, and set her apartment on fire while Ms. Baker lay dying? If Tara Baker was Chris Melton's future fiance, why would he forget whether she told him she would be alone the night before her death? You have to decide if that's something an individual that's been with somebody for 2 years would forget. Is that something a boyfriend or a husband or a fiance would forget if their loved one was killed due to being home alone? You have to ask yourself, how did Mr. Melton respond to Ms. Baker's death? And you heard the testimony on that, and we'll talk about that. But what I ask you to do is pay attention to the physical evidence. We're going to talk about the physical evidence. Pay attention to the science. The science is the most important thing in this case. The state wants you to believe that the DNA is everything. The science is going to be the most important thing in this case, and we're going to talk to you about the science. Pay attention to the medical facts that were given to you. But also pay attention to the integrity, which is the very essence, the integrity of this investigation. But you also saw something during the course of the trial that none of us might have expected. Something that should sadden, something that maybe would anger us. On full display.
We'll get a break. Coming up, the best of the defense closing arguments in the Tara Baker murder trial, plus another high-profile trial set to begin in Georgia. The trial against Colin Gray. The jury is being instructed before opening statements. Stay with us.
This is true crime all the time.
We are live in courtrooms across the country.
We continue our gavel-to-gavel coverage.
This is what I love to do. I'm Vinny Politan. Welcome to Closing Arguments.
What's happening here?
It's unreal. Let me show you exactly what happened.
Closing Arguments with Vinny Politan, tonight at 8/7 Central, only on Court TV.
This morning, we're about to be on verdict watch in the Tara Baker murder trial. Edrick Faust, will he be convicted of murdering the UGA law student? We're playing the very best of the closing arguments. Let's go back into the Georgia courtroom for more of the defense close.
You saw the lengths to which some, and only some, police officers will go to avoid admitting there were mistakes made in the investigation of Ms. Baker's case, to protect their own at the expense of the rest of us, at the expense of Mr. Faust, who is an innocent man. Before we examine the evidence in this case, which we absolutely will do, we need to understand the very foundation of the entire system of justice in which we operate. It is the bedrock on which this entire system is built. Reasonable doubt. And that term, you all have heard it before, but this term isn't just legal jargon. It isn't just a technicality. And it's not a slogan. It is a constitutional shield that protects the innocent and prevents the government from punishing without proof. The state has the high burden to prove every single element of every single offense that they've charged Mr. Faust with. And they have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt, which simply means a doubt for which a reason can be given. Not a vague or arbitrary doubt, but a doubt based upon common sense and reasoning, as the state advised you. But I want to emphasize this because it sounds complicated, but it's very simple. It's a doubt for which a reason can be given. This doubt can be, and the judge will tell you this. What I'm about to tell you, you're going to hear the judge say the exact same thing. This doubt can be based upon a consideration of the state's evidence as a whole, a lack of evidence, or a conflict in the evidence. And those powerful words are not just some legal jargon. They're a mandate. They're your obligation. They're your community's protection against injustice. In our system of justice, Edrick Faust sits here today, presumed innocent. He's cloaked in the presumption of innocence, and it protects him like a suit of armor from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. And that presumption is not fragile. It doesn't just disappear because there's a charge that comes about, or because somebody has a badge, or because the state has a theory. That presumption stands firm unless and until the state clears that high burden. The highest bar the law provides, proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That means at the end of this case, at the end of this trial, you think about one or more of the charges. You think, you know what? Maybe that's true. It might be true what the state is saying. Then, if that's your feeling, you vote not guilty. If you think it's possibly true or probably true, your vote must be not guilty. If someone among you think it's likely true or even very likely to be true, your vote is not guilty. Because none of those standards, maybe, might be, possibly, probably, likely, very likely, none of those meet the extraordinary burden of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, guilt beyond a reasonable doubt has best been explained two ways, in two different ways. One is pretty simple. We've already discussed the first way. It's a doubt for which you can state a reason. That's the simple. If you can state a reason for your doubt, that is the first definition of reasonable doubt. But that reason has to be based upon common sense and reason, right? We can't say an alien came down, committed this crime, and left evidence of Mr. Faust being there. That's fanciful. That isn't a reasonable doubt. A reasonable doubt is based upon common sense and reason. So don't violate your oath and say, well, hey, I think it's a conspiracy theory. Some other people did it, and they're just snatching up Mr. Faust. Let me make that clear. Some other people that have not been mentioned in this case, some other people in another country, aliens, animals, whatever. That is not a reasonable doubt, because that wouldn't be based upon common sense and reason. But if you could state one reason, a reason to doubt the state's case, your verdict must be not guilty. Now, as a jury, you have rules and principles just like we have them in our homes and in our businesses. We also have them in court. So you find a truthful verdict within the confines of the law that is given to you by the honorable court. So if you want to say the state never presented evidence showing how Mr. Faust's DNA means rape, there's no physical evidence or witnesses connecting Mr. Faust to Ms. Baker's home. And also add the fact that Dr. Falzone, who testified here, told us based on the injuries to Ms. Baker's anus, she was sexually assaulted anally. Dr. Falzone told us that.
All right, that was a bit of the defense close before the jury starts to deliberate in the next few hours here. Let's bring in Tommy Pope, last word here on this case. Then I want to switch gears to our other Georgia case before we break. The defense attorney from the very beginning was very aggressive and very seems to really believe in his client. That can make a difference, can it not, when that sort of energy is absorbed by jurors?
I think it can, as I stated earlier, sometimes your conduct in a courtroom can push the jury the other way, but I think in his closing, he's level, he's solid. You know, so many times you lose credibility talking about beyond a reasonable doubt when the case is abundant and clear, but I think in this circumstance, he's got a legitimate argument. I think it's a very difficult case for the prosecution, and if they come back with the verdict of guilty, I really would be surprised in this case.